without further ado, let's jump in. So the Renaissance, remember, is this period. For our purposes, we're going to start in 1440 today. The test exam actually starts in 1450 and goes, to the modern. Well, it goes to 1914 this year. So we're going to focus in this SPRITE chart on 1440 to 1560. So this is going to be a little bit of a timeline review, a little bit of a Renaissance review, a little bit of a SPRITE review. So buckle up. So first off, socially, women are not equal to men. Remember that Baldassare Castiglione writes this book called The Courtier, in which he spells out what it means to be the perfect Renaissance gentleman. Remember that women should be just as awesome as men, but not flaunt it. Now, something that we didn't really talk about when we talked about this in class is that these are the upper class people. This whole idea of a courtier, somebody who is a member of a court of a prince or a king or a duke or whatever, that's not going to be your everyday guy on the street or even your everyday guy in the countryside. And so the relationship between men and women in the countryside is different than it is for men and women in cities and men and women in upper class versus the other, well, I guess we wouldn't call it upper class, it'd be your first and second estate versus your third estate. But by and large, women are not really seen to be equal to men. And this goes back to, the idea of Roman times when Roman men were the head of the household. So we'll get into more of that as we go through here. As far as the social hierarchy goes, by and large, and I know usually when we talk about the Renaissance, we talk about Italy the most, but by and large, throughout all of Europe, we've got the three estates, right? We've got the clergy, the first estate, the monarchs and the nobles, the second estate, and then everybody else. Remember that really up until this point, everybody else meant everybody in the countryside, all these peasants who were farming. However, you're starting to get these urban artisans, and they don't fit the mold, right? They're not everyone else. They have skills, they have money, and they're starting to rise. Remember, you may have heard of cities with like the last syllable of it is borough or burg, like Edinburgh in Scotland, or Owensboro in Western Kentucky, or something like that. Boonesboro between Clark County and Madison County. That's where the word bourgeoisie starts. And so these boroughs, these towns, these cities have got up and coming artisans and bourgeoisie in them, and they're starting to not fit this three-layer cake of the old regime, the ancient regime. Politically speaking, we've got a lot of stuff going on in Italy. We've got a lot of stuff going on up in Northern and Western Europe as well. So I thought we'd start with the new monarchies that are forming in England, Spain, and France. Remember, this is the part of history, the part of the class where we started to highlight the conflict between the monarchs and the nobility and how they are competing for power. And it's during this time period, they're called the new monarchies for a reason. It's not that kings just started here. It's that kings in this era started to do things differently. And they started to consolidate more power to the king and utilize the nobility a lot less. And so the monarchs are really trying to edge out the nobles who up until this point had been the helpers of the monarch. And to do this, they are using those middle class groups of people to undercut the nobility. Remember, it's the middle class who are the tax collectors now. It's the middle class who are running errands for the king. The monarchs are really trying to use the nobility a lot less to try to edge them out. And they're using new forms of taxation in order to enrich and empower themselves. And so we start to see a lot of wealth consolidating in the hands of people like Henry VIII, Louis XI, Ferdinand and Isabella. These are your new monarchs that are rising during this time period. In Italy, we've got competing city-states, and this is honestly, this is great. This is great for Italy because it means that each city-state is really competing with each other for taxes, for trade, but also to show off. And that's where you're going to get the huge influx of art that you get in the Renaissance as these city-states compete with each other to show off. I am awesome. Here's my art. And then the next city-state is like, oh, they think they're awesome. Well, I got this art. And so what we see is this big flourishing of art as the different rulers of the different city-states start to show off. Up in the German lands, we've got serious amount of competition in these principalities. Remember, Germany is not a country. It's not unified. It's not even close. Um, and so the German lands are competing with each other as well, competing against each other, but they're also competing against the Holy Roman Emperor who's trying to control them. And that's going to be sort of an underlying theme during this phase of history in Europe. Big event, 1453. This is when the Ottoman Empire falls, or sorry, it takes over Constantinople. The Ottoman Empire doesn't fall. The Ottoman Empire takes over Constantinople and renames it Istanbul. This is a huge blow to the West. This is, the Turks had been rising. This is really the point where the Turks get on the map of some of these major monarchs, especially the Holy Roman Emperor. This is also a moment when a lot of scholars leave Constantinople and come to Rome, which has, has re-risen as a new major state, as a new major city-state in Italy. And they bring with them guys like Plato, Aristotle, Averroes, guys who are going to add to the intellectual movement that we're going to see in a couple of slides. This is also the moment when Machiavelli writes The Prince. And that becomes, as we have said before, the first real work of political science in the Western canon. Remember, he says things like the ends justify the means, as basically saying that it doesn't matter how you get there, it doesn't matter who you have to go through, as long as you end up in power in the end, that's what matters. Also says things like, it's better to be feared than loved, or something like that. Of course, if you're Michael Scott, it's I want people to fear how much they love me. But we can talk about that some other time. Let's see, so religious, so we're SPR, religious. In the Renaissance era, the Catholic Church is all that and a bag of chips. They control everything. They are very much against reform. The popes are very powerful and they like it that way. They're very rich and they like it that way. They have been for a really long time, and they're getting richer, and they're continuing to be more and more influential. And so efforts to reform are squashed, flattened, though it is in this era, 1517, when Martin Luther publishes his 95 Theses. We'll talk more about the Reformation as a movement in the next video. But this 1517 is typically seen as the start of the Reformation, though as we learned in class, this is not the first attempt to reform the Catholic Church. There were others. They just typically ended in that whoever stood up to the church getting lit on fire. So, and we'll talk more in the next video about how Luther doesn't get caught on fire and why that is, what makes him so special. Over in Spain, we've got a huge movement to reconquer the peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula had been conquered, at least in part, by Muslims out of Morocco, and Spain had spent a lot of blood and treasure trying to reconquer that. And in 1492, they complete what they call the Reconquista, where they kick all the Muslims out of Spain. And so Spain is riding high on this tide of religious fervor. In 1492, which you may recognize as the date, the year in which Columbus sets sail and makes landfall in the Americas. And so this is going to heavily influence the way the Spanish interact with the Native Americans as they begin to settle the Americas. So, like I said, it's a very religious time in France. And so that's going to, this whole push to convert the natives is going to be big, and this is why. It's also during this time period that the Spanish invite in the Inquisition. From Rome, they bring in the Inquisition and these inquisitors, basically these monks who are in charge of rooting out heresy within the Spanish Empire, are more or less given free reign. And so Jews within the Spanish Empire are persecuted and forced to convert. Muslims who are left over from the Muslim king, the Moorish king kingdom that had been there, Granada, are also forced to convert or expelled. Um, this creates a rather, I don't know, it's not a huge population, but it's a sizable population of religious converts called conversos. And they're always treated with suspicion because people think that on the sly, they're really not Christians. They're still Jewish or Muslim, or um, basically that the conversion was fake. And it may have been, we don't really know, but eventually the Jews and the Muslims are expelled from Spain. And similar to what you're going to see when the Huguenots are persecuted after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, we see a lot of people who were Jewish and Muslim, who were these conversos, um, holding powerful economic spots. And so this is really going to weaken Spain, this lack of toleration for other religions. But that's also sort of the MO of this era. Um, all right, let's move on to I, intellectual. And as I've said before, this is a big one. You can even see that the text got a lot smaller for this slide than it was in the previous slide. So as far as intellectual is concerned, the big movements of the era focus on classical art and literature and the rediscovery and the rebirth of those techniques. And so a lot of that, it goes back to humanism. People become enamored with the study of ancient Greek and Roman texts and those ancient Greek and Roman values, and they try to bring them. They very consciously try to bring them back. Um, into this early modern period of the 1400s and early 1500s. We talked about Neoplatonism and how the ideas of Plato come back. And remember, that's that idea that there's a perfect world and the world in which we live, and we in the world in which we live are constantly striving to achieve that perfection, to get closer to that perfection. Um, and we talked in class about how that really fits well with the Catholic Christian mindset of here we are and we're trying to perfect ourselves in a religious way. And this Neoplatonism says no, we don't have to. It doesn't have to be religious. We can just improve ourselves because it's good to improve ourselves. But it's not just Plato that comes back. It's Aristotle, it's Averroes, it's all this learning of the Greeks and Romans that comes back and becomes important again. The overall idea behind humanism is to go back and reread these early texts, these Greek texts, these Roman texts, even these early Christian texts. Find the text that is closest to the original and read it and make sure that we're doing it right, which leads to a lot of issues, right? This whole idea of revisit and question the way things are to try to make them better. And that really becomes, as you may have already noticed, that maybe it becomes a theme throughout the course. Let's go back, let's question, let's ask why, let's try to find the answer to why, and if the answer to why is better than what it is now, then let's revise, let's do it differently. And they're always trying to find new stuff, older stuff. Excuse me, just wanted to demonstrate the proper coughing technique for you. So the other thing that comes out of this idea of humanism isn't just intellectual, but it's also art. These new artistic and literature forms are modeled after the classical form. You get an increase in realism, remember, an increase in naturalism, the glorification of the human body. Think of the David. I probably should have put a picture on the side of the slide of the David because he's realistic. He's naturalistic. It's a glorification of the human body. This idea of secularism. It's about the here and now. Don't worry so much about the future, about what's going to happen when you die. Worry about right now, about what it looks like right now. And so we see a shift in the art from extremely religious and allegorical or representational to incredibly realistic and very literal. And I mean, there's still meaning behind the David. It's just that you're supposed to understand the meaning, but also to appreciate the beauty of the art. Remember that there are two different Renaissances. That there's one in Italy, and there's one in the north, and that they are different. And it's at this point that I would rep out that graphic organizer we did back in August to compare the Italian Renaissance to the Northern Renaissance. Dig back through your notes, find it, and take a look at this again, because it's really good. And it helps to sort of pick out what are the big differences. Remember what allowed it to start. We're going to get to that. What inspired it? Remember, the Italian Renaissance is inspired by those classical texts. The Northern Renaissance is inspired by the Italian Renaissance. Who are the patrons? We went through that. In other words, who's got the money? The subjects of art, remember, one is much more religious than the other, that the Italian Renaissance is a lot more secular, the Northern Renaissance is a lot more intentionally religious. And so what did humanists value? What did art look like? We went through that in class. So I would encourage you to go back, dig that up. And if you can't dig it up, then do it again. You have your book, the book that we used for this section is at your house, or at least it should be. And if it's not, then all the documents, all the text that you would need is on Classroom. All your old homework assignments are still on Classroom. Let's see here. Just to make sure that we cover all the bases, as we get in through this intellectual period, we've also got Copernicus. He is writing, he publishes in 1543, which is right square in the middle of this time period, this Renaissance time period. And so the idea of the heliocentric universe reemerges during this time period. Copernicus publishes this, and so this is, we're not quite to Kepler, who's going to mathematically prove these things. We're not quite to Galileo, who's going to use that telescope to see things. But the scientific revolution is kicking off during this Renaissance era that we're talking about. The discovery of the Americas, we talked about 1492, that's going to kick off loads of curiosity. People are going to ask themselves, in this humanist idea, they're going to revisit and question the way things are. We had no idea about all this stuff. And remember, this is also going to encourage those early scientific revolutionaries to go further, to renounce the idea of scholasticism, that knowledge has already, all the truth that there is has already been discovered. They're going to say, you didn't know anything about this whole America place, so clearly the ancients didn't know everything. What else didn't they know? And so that's going to be a big movement that's going to start in this era as well. And then finally, well, not finally, but down to T, technological. The biggest invention of the entire course is the printing press. I hope you understand that, and I hope you see that by this point, that literacy is everything. Getting people to read, and the more people that we get to read, the more we're not just talking about the upper class like we are here. The more literacy spreads, the more people we're talking about are following these different trends that are in these SPRITE charts. The printing press, I cannot underscore enough how important the printing press is. In fact, it's so important, that's the reason this starts in 1440 and not 1450, because Gutenberg in the city of Mainz more or less invents printing during the 1440s. And presses out his first Bible in 1455, and Gutenberg becomes incredibly wealthy because of his printing press. But he also encourages literacy, which I cannot say how important literacy is to the modern world. And then finally, we got the Age of Exploration, right? It kicks off during this time period. Columbus, 1492. Bartholomew Diaz, 1488, goes around the southern tip of Africa. And Vasco da Gama in 1498, sailing for Portugal, goes all the way to India and back, starting off that era of Portuguese hegemony in the Indian Ocean. All of that is what's going to spark this age of exploration. Well, E is going to spark the age of exploration. We'll talk about that on the last slide. But we get the caravel, which is the new boat. We get the magnetic compass, which is, that thing that points north. We get new maps and better cartographic techniques. We get better star charts. People start looking up at the sky, which is where you get this guy like Copernicus down here, and Kepler, and Brahe with the bronze nose, you know, and the nose falls off and gets angry. Like all of that, these are all technological advances that occur because of exploration. So let's talk about exploration. Why exploration? You got it, the spices. Mediterranean spice trade has made the northern Italian city-states incredibly rich. And it's this money that's going to spark off the Renaissance. It's this money that's going to make Florence, Genoa, Milan, Rome, Venice incredibly wealthy. Venice is a shipping city-state. Genoa is a shipping city-state. Milan lies at the foot of a gap within the Alps that is a trade route into northern Europe. Florence is a center of banking. Rome is where the church is, and all the money that comes through these 4 or 5 city-states is there because of the spice trade. And it's these other countries like Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, they want a slice of that pie, right? And so they go out exploring. It's this transnational spice trade that kicks off this whole era. It's funny to think that, you know, pepper and cinnamon and nutmeg and ginger are the things that really push this whole Renaissance era, but it kind of boils down to that. It launches the age of exploration. It launches the Renaissance. It launches the push for people to have enough money to have spare time to make the art, to study the books. Like I said, Portugal, first to sail around Africa, Bartholomew Diaz, and then after Columbus, da Gama sails to India and back. But then again, like I said, Columbus also sails in 1492 for the Americas, and becomes the first imperial. That kicks off the first imperial period, right? I mean, the 13 colonies wouldn't exist without Columbus, and Columbus wouldn't have sailed without spices. And so Spain, Portugal, rise to the top. Spain especially, as you know, this is the golden age of Spain. This is when they just got loads and loads and loads of cash. They've got silver coming out of these mines in Mexico and Peru. They've got gold coming out of the Aztecs and the Inca territory in the conquest of those people groups. And it's this time period that starts that first imperial period. And so, like I said, economics is not last because it's least important. It's last because that's how you spell SPRITE. And so economics are incredibly important to this era. All right, so that's our SPRITE chart for the Renaissance. I know I didn't hit everything. That was not the intent. The intent of a SPRITE chart is to hit the high points and to then move on.